My name is Martha. I'm 74 years old, and I've lived in the same house on Willow Street for nearly 5 decades. Or at least, I thought I still lived there. It was a modest two-story craftsman with creaky floorboards, a slanted porch, and a white fence I repainted every spring. The kind of house that smells like cinnamon and old paperbacks. The kind where every picture on the wall meant something. The kind of house that felt like me. After my stroke, the doctors said I was lucky. The clot hadn't spread far. I'd need physical therapy, some rest, and maybe a bit of help moving around, but I'd walk again. I'd cook again. I'd go home. That's what I held on to, lying there in that rehab center with the gray sheets and flickering fluorescent lights. Home. My kitchen table. My roses out front. The old Pyrex dishes I kept, even though the kids begged me to upgrade. The smell of coffee at 5:30 a.m. drifting through the house before the town even blinked awake. What I didn't know, what no one told me until it was too late, was that while I was relearning how to hold a fork, my children were signing papers behind my back. They sold my house. My house. No warning, no visit, not even a phone call. They said it was for my own good, said I needed care, said it was time to let go, as if I were an old casserole dish taking up space in their cabinet. But here's the thing about getting older. People forget what you used to be, what you still are. They forgot I ran a diner 6 days a week for 40 years, that I paid off every debt, that I raised 2 kids after burying their father far too soon, that I've known how to stretch $1 into a dream since before they were born. They forgot who they were messing with, and what they never even thought to ask, what no one saw coming, is that I didn't just own that house on Willow Street. I owned the whole damn block. It was the kind of morning that used to bring me peace. I'd wake up before the sun, when the light was soft and the world hadn't quite remembered to be busy yet. I'd shuffle into the kitchen, still in my housecoat, and start the coffee. Folgers, nothing fancy, just the same blend I'd used since 1978. I'd sit by the window, watch the mist lift from the lawn, and listen to the robins bicker in the trees. That house on Willow Street had its creaks and quirks. The porch tilted a little to the right. The faucet in the guest bathroom whined when it got cold. But I knew every square inch of it like the back of my hand. That house knew me too. It had seen me through raising 2 children, burying a husband, and running a diner that served everything from meatloaf to marriage proposals. The town knew me as Miss Martha from the Griddle House. People used to say I gave out more advice than hash browns, and that might have been true. But time changes people, especially family. Ethan, my eldest, had always been sharp, ambitious. Too ambitious, maybe. He left for college and came back with a suit and a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere more important than here. He married a woman who wore heels to Sunday service and called my home quaint. They lived 3 streets over, in a house I once helped him pay the down payment for. I did it quietly. I always did things quietly. Lori was my baby, always sweeter, always softer. But maybe that softness hardened with time. She visited often at first. Then it became birthdays only. Then just cards. Then silence. They still said the right things. "We love you, Mom. You should rest more. Maybe you shouldn't be living alone anymore." But there was a tone underneath it all. A tightening in Ethan's jaw when I said I didn't want to sell. A sigh in Lori's voice when I reminded her that I still drove myself to the grocery store. They thought I was slipping. I could feel it in every forced smile. Every time they asked if I remembered to take my pills. Every time they stopped by with realtors' cards they just happened to have in their pockets. But I wasn't slipping. I was standing still, and they were rushing past me like I was a relic they didn't know what to do with. And so I stayed quiet. I kept making coffee at 5:30 a.m., I kept repainting the porch every spring. I kept pretending I didn't hear them whispering in the next room when they thought I'd fallen asleep. I thought, maybe if I held on tight enough, they'd remember who I used to be. I didn't realize they had already decided who I wasn't. The first time I noticed something truly off, it was a Tuesday. I remember because that was the day Mr. Collins came by to trim the hedges. He knocked gently, as he always did, and asked if I'd agreed to have a man come photograph the property for a new insurance valuation. I hadn't. I told him I'd look into it, but deep down, a cold knot formed in my stomach. 2 days later, I found a brochure in my mailbox, slick and shiny, with my front porch smiling back at me like it belonged to someone else. "A charming fixer-upper in the heart of Willow Street," it read. I called Ethan. Straight to voicemail. I tried Lori. She answered, all sweet and syrupy, pretending to be surprised. "Oh, that must be a mistake, Mom. Those flyers go out everywhere." I knew she was lying. I could hear it in her breath. Next came the home visit. Lori showed up with a woman in scrubs and a fake smile, introducing her as just someone who can help around the house. I said I didn't need help. Lori looked at me like I'd barked at a ghost. The woman stood there silently, holding a clipboard with my name on it. Ethan followed not long after. He arrived with a real estate agent, unannounced. He said he was just exploring options, that I deserved something easier. I asked him to leave. He smiled like I was being difficult, like I didn't know what I was talking about. I began hiding things, my deed, my bank statements, my will. I placed them in a box inside the old flower bin no one had touched in years. It made me feel foolish, like I was preparing for war in my own kitchen. But some part of me knew something was coming, something I wouldn't be able to stop once it started. One afternoon, I caught Lori in my bedroom. She said she was looking for my medication. The cabinet she was rummaging through didn't have a single pill bottle, but it did have my lockbox. When I asked what she was really looking for, her smile faltered just a little too long. I stopped answering the door after that. I stopped leaving the house unless I had to. The neighbors noticed. Some asked if I was okay. I told them I was fine. I wasn't. The loneliness came next. And the doubt. Was I being paranoid? Was I imagining things? Maybe I was too old, too stubborn. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe Lori meant well. Maybe they were just worried. That's what they told me, over and over in patient voices and tight embraces. But their eyes kept flicking to the hallway, the bedroom door, the drawer where I kept my checkbook. They weren't checking on me. They were casing the place. And like a fool, I was still hoping they'd change their minds. The phone call came on a Wednesday. I was in the middle of making a peach cobbler, my hands sticky with sugar and old muscle memory, when the rehab facility's administrator knocked on my door. "Miss Carter," she said gently, "there's something you should see." She handed me a packet, overnight mail. Inside, a letter from a law office I didn't recognize, and a copy of a finalized real estate transaction. My name was there, printed neatly under the line marked seller. But the signature wasn't mine. I stared at it like it might rearrange itself, like maybe the universe had made a clerical error. But no, it was done. The papers were stamped, dated, notarized. My house, had been sold. I felt something leave me in that moment. Not air, not words, something deeper. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, cobbler forgotten on the tray behind me. Later that day, Ethan and Lori showed up at the facility. They didn't even look ashamed. "Mom, we wanted to talk to you in person," Ethan said, folding his arms like he was settling a business deal. "It's time you accepted some help." "You sold my home," I whispered. Lori stepped forward, voice syrupy sweet. "It was the best decision, Mom. That house wasn't safe. Stairs, clutter, no security system. We found you a great assisted living center. It's got a lake view and scheduled bingo. Bingo. They had sold my life for a view of a man-made pond and Thursday night bingo. I asked them who signed the papers. Ethan glanced at Lori. We handled it. You were incapacitated. We acted in your best interest. I shook my head, not to argue, but to stop myself from screaming. I had given them everything. Every penny I saved went into raising them, schooling them, feeding them, loving them. And they sold my home while I was learning how to walk again. Like I was already gone. Like I didn't exist. I'm not dead, I said quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened. You weren't in any condition to manage property, Mom. They called it protection. I called it betrayal. And they smiled as if they'd done me a favor. That night, when the nurse came to check my vitals, I asked her to bring me a copy of the facility's phone book. My hands still trembled from the stroke, but I flipped the pages one by one until I found the name I was looking for. Charles Hanley, my lawyer. The only man who'd ever treated my name on paper like it still meant something. I dialed the number slowly. When his voice came on the line, I didn't cry. I just said, "Charlie, it's time." I didn't sleep that night. I barely breathed. The room felt smaller than it had ever been. The pale green walls of the rehab center, once dull and forgettable, now felt like they were pressing in on me, like the whole world had shrunk to 4 suffocating corners. I kept thinking of the doorknob in my hallway at home, the way it rattled unless you turned it just right. I thought about the sound the kettle made when it boiled, that little squeal before the whistle. I thought about the dent in the living room floor where Richard dropped the piano bench back in '89. He cursed so loud the cat hid for a week. All of it, gone, sold, signed away like it meant nothing, like I meant nothing. The next morning, the nurse said I hadn't touched my breakfast. I hadn't noticed. They brought eggs and toast and some limp melon cubes. I looked at it like it was a foreign object. I didn't want food. I wanted my front porch. I wanted my damn rose bushes. I wanted my life back. The other patients asked if I was okay. I lied. I said I was just tired. But the truth was, I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped the center of me and left the shell propped upright. I stopped doing the exercises. I stopped trying to walk. What was the point? My goal had been to go home, but I no longer had one. I barely spoke. The nurses grew worried. One even brought me a little battery-operated radio, thinking music might help. It didn't. Nothing did. On the 4th day, I asked if I could sit outside. They wheeled me to the small garden patio out back, just a square of concrete with a few dying plants and a crooked bench. But there was a bird there, a mourning dove, sitting quietly on the railing. I stared at it for a long time. It reminded me of something, though I didn't know what. Maybe how stillness can be a kind of prayer. Maybe how surviving isn't the same as living, but it's the first step. Tears came, slow and uninvited. Not the loud sobs of rage or grief, just quiet streams, like my body was trying to say what my mouth no longer could. How could they? How could my own children? I had pictured growing old, surrounded by photos and cookbooks and mismatched throw pillows that no one else liked. I thought I'd die in that house, peacefully, maybe in the middle of folding laundry, something simple, something still mine. Instead, I was here, alive, yes, but displaced, undone, floating without anchor. That night, I stared at the ceiling and whispered into the dark, "What did I do wrong?" There was no answer, just the hum of the fluorescent light and the faint ache in my chest that never really went away. It was 1984, the summer Richard died. Cancer doesn't wait for good timing. One minute we were planning to repaint the back bedroom, and the next, We were counting morphine pills and measuring time in hours instead of years. He went quickly. Too quickly. One moment, he was still cracking jokes about hospital food, and the next, he was gone. I remember sitting in the hallway outside his room after they pulled the curtain, holding the paper coffee cup he never finished. It went cold in my hands. So did everything else. I had 2 kids, a mortgage, and a diner barely breaking even. That fall, I started opening the griddle house at 5 a.m. instead of 6. I cooked, I cleaned, I waited tables, and I smiled like my heart wasn't breaking under the apron. The regulars noticed. Some tipped better, some hugged longer. But the bills didn't care how sad I was. Ethan was 12, Lori just 9. They didn't ask for much, bless them. But kids always know. One night I found Ethan in the hallway, ear pressed to the vent, listening to me cry in the kitchen. He pretended to be sleepwalking when I caught him. I pretended not to know. The hardest part wasn't the grief, it was the math. I had to choose between fixing the roof or paying for Ethan's school trip to DC. I chose the trip. I laid out pots in the hallway during storms, catching leaks like it was normal. I didn't want him to be the only kid who didn't get to see the Lincoln Memorial. Then came the year of the engine fire. My old Buick gave out on the way to work, smoke billowing into the cold January air. I walked the last 3 blocks in slush with my boots soaked through, opened the diner late, and still managed to serve 10 plates of biscuits and gravy before 8 a.m. Later that month, I sold my wedding ring. I didn't tell the kids. I just told them I'd finally stopped wearing it because it caught on my gloves. But the truth was, I needed the money for Lori's inhaler and Ethan's first semester books. He was starting at the community college across town. I didn't want him to feel like it was second best, so I made him a big breakfast that morning, kissed his forehead, and handed him a check like it was nothing. He cried when he saw it. I pretended not to notice. I spent most of that year pretending not to notice things, like how thin Lori was getting because I kept feeding them second helpings and skipping my own plate, or how my hands were starting to tremble from exhaustion, or how I hadn't been to church in months because Sunday was the only day I could sleep past 4. But I'd do it again, every damn bit of it. That house, that diner, those kids, they were my whole world. I didn't need vacations or jewelry or quiet. I needed them to feel safe, to feel normal, to believe the world was kind, even when I knew it often wasn't. Years later, Ethan told me he never noticed we were struggling. He said, "You made everything look easy." And I remember thinking, that's how I know I did it right. But looking back from that rehab room, surrounded by silence and betrayal, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made it look too easy, if they'd forgotten it was built on my bones. It started with a sound, a click, soft, metallic, faint as breath. I'd been dozing in the wheelchair they parked me in near the window, drifting between the now and the before, when I heard it. The latch on my purse. I opened my eyes to see an aide walking away. Probably harmless, probably checking for tissues or gum or a pen. But it stirred something in me, a tremor beneath the ribs. I reached for the bag, pulled it onto my lap, rifled through the side pocket, the one no one ever bothered with. It was still there. A key. Small, brass, slightly tarnished. The key to the safety deposit box I'd opened 20 years ago under my maiden name. Richard used to tease me about it. "What are you hiding in there? Gold bars? Secret recipes?" I'd just smile, because some things weren't for sharing. Not even with love. Inside that box, in a bank across town, were copies of every property deed I'd ever acquired. 5 houses, 1 duplex, 2 lots still undeveloped, and 1 envelope labeled, "In case they forget." I don't know when I started collecting them. Maybe after Richard passed. Maybe after the first time I saw the look in Ethan's eyes, that hunger for upward mobility. Maybe I just needed to know I'd always have something that couldn't be taken from me without my say-so. But I had forgotten. Somewhere along the way, I got tired. I let the routine of living dull the sharp edge of memory. Not anymore. I wheeled myself to the nurse's station and asked to make a phone call. The nurse gave me a look. Concern, surprise, maybe even pity. But she handed me the receiver. I dialed slowly. The number was still in my mind, crisp and clean like a prayer. Charles Hanley picked up on the second ring. "Charlie," I said, and my voice was steady. "I need you to retrieve something from the bank for me." There was a pause. "Are we doing this, Martha?" I closed my eyes, felt the key in my palm, warm from my grip. "We are." After I hung up, I didn't go back to my room. I sat outside instead. It was windy. The trees bowed and whispered. Somewhere, leaves were falling, but inside me, something was rising. Resolve doesn't always come like fire. Sometimes it's a slow return, a forgotten warmth, a name you remember how to answer to. I wasn't done. Not yet. They'd taken my house, but they hadn't taken me. Charles Hanley was the kind of man who wore the same wool coat every winter for 20 years and still said ma'am to the women who'd grown up calling him Chuck. We'd met back in the late 80s when he was fresh out of law school and needed someone to believe in him. I hired him to write up a lease for the Griddle House's back storage unit. He charged me $50 and forgot to bill me for 2 months. He never forgot anything again after that. By the time I called him from the rehab center, Charles had handled everything from my late husband's will to a very messy zoning dispute over a fence line. And, more importantly, he was the only person I'd ever trusted with the full picture. It began with a phone call and ended with a manila folder. The next week, Charles showed up at the rehab center in a brown suit that needed pressing and eyes that gleamed with purpose. He wheeled in a briefcase, sat across from me in the common room, and laid out the truth like it was a Sunday sermon. "Here's what you own, Martha," he said, flipping through the folder. "House on Maple Drive, duplex on Carson Lane, the old brick 2-bedroom next to the post office, a commercial lot across from the high school that I'd been renting to a used bookstore for 12 years, and, of course, the 2 undeveloped lots on the edge of town. The ones Ethan had once joked about flipping when the market's hot. And finally, my original house on Willow Street." "You never transferred title to anyone else," Charles said. "Not your kids, not even jointly. All of this is still in your name. Ethan and Lori forged your signature, but they don't have a leg to stand on, especially since you've already had power of attorney revoked." "How bad will it get for them?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "They committed real estate fraud. It won't be pretty, but that's for later." He slid over the envelope labeled, "In case they forget." Inside were handwritten notes I'd penned to myself over the years. Receipts, letters, a timeline, a copy of my living will, notarized and witnessed, a photo of Richard in the backyard, holding a "for sale" sign we'd never put up, laughing. I'd been collecting proof for decades, not just of ownership, but of intention, my intentions, because I knew how easily people forget. I remembered the first property I ever bought. It was a rundown ranch house with siding that peeled like sunburned skin. I used the insurance payout from Richard's passing and a small inheritance from my mother. The realtor looked surprised when I told him it was for me, not Ethan. "You're investing?" he asked. "I'm preparing," I replied. And prepare I did. Every lease I wrote, I kept a copy. Every tax statement, every late-night note scribbled on the back of diner menus, I kept it all. Because one day, I might need to prove that I didn't just survive. I built. And they thought I was just a tired old woman in a bathrobe. They didn't know about the side bank account I'd opened under my middle name, the one with 10 years of rental income, untouched. They didn't know about the fireproof box hidden in the Griddle House's attic, stuffed with documents and originals. They didn't know I'd created a revocable trust the same year Ethan turned 30. I wasn't just their mother. I was the architect of the very ground they stood on. Charles closed the folder and looked at me with something between admiration and awe. "So," he said, "what do you want to do next?" I leaned back in the wheelchair, folded my hands over my stomach, and said, "It's time they learn who raised them." And in that moment, for the first time in weeks, I smiled. The first thing Charles did was call the bank. I sat beside him in the little conference room the rehab center let us use once a week. It had dusty blinds, a wheezy air conditioner, and one flickering light. But it was ours, our war room. Within days, he'd pulled the documents. He faxed a cease and desist to the brokerage firm that processed the fraudulent sale. He filed preliminary paperwork to have the title reversed and reported the forgery to the district attorney. I didn't understand all the legal talk, but I understood one thing: momentum. And we had it now. Next came the revocation of power of attorney. I signed the new documents with my hands still trembling, but my signature came out steady. The notary looked at me and smiled. "Nice penmanship," she said. I smiled back. Charles had me designate a new medical advocate, one of the nurses, actually, a kind woman named Teresa, who always brought me chamomile tea instead of coffee without being asked. We then drafted a new living will. In it, I made 3 things clear. 1, under no circumstances were Ethan or Lori to make decisions on my behalf. 2, any attempt to do so would result in the immediate transfer of authority to a public guardian. 3, all of my properties were to be placed in a protected trust, irrevocable, managed independently. After that, we changed the locks, literally and figuratively. Charles visited each property in person. He met with tenants, confirmed lease terms, and secured new codes for the security systems. At the Willow Street house, he found a stack of unopened mail and a pair of shoes that weren't mine by the front door. Ethan had started squatting there. Charles had them removed within 48 hours. While he was doing that, I was writing letters to each tenant, letting them know the transition in management wouldn't affect their leases. A note to the Griddle House's current operator, offering a rent break in exchange for letting me store documents upstairs again. And a final, longer letter to myself. It began, "If you ever feel like giving up again, remember this week." By Friday, we had everything locked down. Assets frozen, accounts reviewed, passwords changed, deeds re-recorded. The fraudulent sale of the Willow Street house was officially under investigation. Ethan and Lori hadn't even realized yet. They were still living inside the illusion of control. But illusions crack, and I wasn't about to let them drag me down again. Late one night, Charles handed me a small folder, black leather, zipped. Inside was everything we'd done: paperwork, copies, dates. He called it my freedom kit. "Keep it close," he said, "just in case they come sniffing around again." I slid it under my pillow. That night I slept for the first time in weeks. The trap wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve raised voices, courtroom standoffs, or handcuffs in the rain. No. It started with a single certified envelope. Charles mailed it on a Tuesday morning. Inside were 3 things. 1, a letter from my new legal representative revoking all previous powers of attorney. 2, a copy of the deed transfer reversal request, now formally filed. 3, a court summons. Both Ethan and Lori received their copies the same afternoon. Charles and I were sitting together when the delivery confirmation came through. He showed me the screen on his phone, 2 green check marks. "It's done," he said simply. I nodded. Let's see what happens when they realize I'm not bluffing. We didn't have to wait long. The next morning, Charles forwarded me an email Lori had sent to the property manager on Carson Lane. She demanded a meeting to clarify ownership. The tone was polite, but frantic. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Later that day, a voicemail came from Ethan, angrier this time. "You didn't have to do this, Mom. You're blowing things way out of proportion. All we wanted was to make sure you were taken care of." I didn't respond. Charles had already advised me not to. Instead, I filed the message away with the others. Documentation. Patterns. The growing record of entitlement disguised as concern. Then came the final move. On Thursday, Charles filed an injunction barring any future transactions involving my estate without court oversight. He sent copies to all associated institutions, banks, brokers, tax offices. The system responded, doors closed, access revoked. The next time Ethan tried to access the account tied to the sale, it would decline, loudly. By Friday, the first cracks had formed: a bounced mortgage payment, a frozen line of credit. A tenant at the duplex received a notice asking to reroute rent, only to be told by Charles that it was illegal. It was beginning, and I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to scream. I just had to move the pieces. As Charles slid the final file across the table for my review, I looked at him and said, "You know what the best part is?" He raised an eyebrow. "I'm not even done yet." That night, I sat by the window in my room, looking out at nothing in particular. The lights from the parking lot flickered through the slats in the blinds, casting lines across the walls like prison bars. But I didn't feel trapped anymore. I felt still. There was no celebration, no champagne, no laughter, just a quiet knowing. They thought they'd caged me, put me in a place to forget, but I hadn't forgotten. I remembered everything, and now they would too. I ran my fingers along the edge of the file Charles gave me, the folder labeled execution. Such a cold word, but fitting, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity, about reclaiming what had been twisted. They took my home, so I took away the illusion that they could ever control me again. Let them flail, let them panic. I wasn't their problem anymore. I was their reckoning. It started with a credit card decline. Ethan was at the hardware store trying to buy supplies to fix a plumbing issue in the Maple Drive house. The card, one linked to the account he'd opened under my name, was declined. Twice. He tried to laugh it off with the clerk, but he could feel it. That flush of heat crawling up his neck. That invisible shift in the air when something starts to go wrong. He called the bank from his truck. They asked him security questions. He failed them. Then they told him the account was frozen by court order. He drove straight to Lori's condo, bursting through the front door, tossing his keys onto the counter like they were evidence of betrayal. "What the hell did you do?" he barked. Lori, mid-phone call, raised a finger to hush him. But it was too late. He was pacing already, unraveling in real time. "She's freezing the accounts," he said. "She reversed the deed. I just got off the phone with the bank." Lori hung up. "You're joking." "Do I look like I'm joking?" A beat of silence. Then Lori rushed to her laptop, opened a tenant portal for the Carson Lane duplex. "No rent," she whispered. "Nothing's come in this month." "Because they're paying her lawyer now," Ethan snapped. They sat in silence, the weight of their realizations settling like dust. Across town, a notice appeared on the door of the Willow Street house. It wasn't flashy, just a single sheet of legal paper taped to the wood. Occupancy revoked pending investigation. In smaller print, failure to vacate may result in criminal charges. Ethan returned home to find it fluttering in the breeze. He stood on the porch for a long time, staring at the words like they might rearrange themselves. Like maybe if he blinked hard enough, they'd go away. But they didn't. That night, he and Lori sat at her kitchen table with 2 laptops, 5 browser tabs, and an unopened bottle of wine. "Okay," Lori said, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "We can still fix this." We talk to the lawyer, we explain. Explain what? That we committed fraud? That we forged Mom's signature because we thought she wouldn't notice? She was supposed to be gone, Lori muttered. She was supposed to be out of the picture. That sentence hung in the air like smoke. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. When Ethan finally did, his voice was low, bitter. She was never out. We just stopped looking. By morning, they had emails from their banks about suspicious activity flags. Lori's credit card had a hold. Ethan's line of credit was now pending review. And then came the kicker. A formal notice from the court arrived, summoning them both for a preliminary hearing regarding elder financial abuse. They stared at it, white-faced, like it had been dipped in poison. Because this wasn't just a setback. This was a reckoning, and it had only just begun. Lori stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. The sound of ceramic on ceramic was sharp and pointless. Ethan was pacing, again. "It was your idea," he snapped. "You said she was too far gone to notice, that we were doing her a favor." "She'd just had a stroke," Lori shot back. "She couldn't even hold a pen. You think I forged those documents by myself? You handled the paperwork. And you deposited the checks." They stared at each other. Years of shared secrets and carefully balanced resentments finally tilting. Ethan threw his hands in the air. "I should have known you'd screw this up." "Screw this up? You're the one who moved into the house like you owned it. You practically dared her to come after us." "She wasn't supposed to recover," he said. Quiet, then louder, like he was trying to convince himself. "She wasn't supposed to bounce back." Lori let the plate slip into the sink with a clatter. There it was, the thing they hadn't said out loud. The hope that she would fade, quietly and conveniently, that they could rewrite the ending. But she didn't. She came back, and now they were drowning. Their inboxes were full of notices. The mailbox had a new letter every day. Courthouse, law firm, tax authority. Friends stopped inviting them to dinner. Coworkers whispered. Lori's boss called her in just to check on things, eyes full of polite distance. Ethan's wife, Rachel, packed a bag and took the kids to her mother's place until things settled down. She didn't say when that might be. Lori received a text from her ex-husband that read, "Is this about your mom's house? People are asking." She didn't respond. One night, Ethan showed up at Lori's door drunk, pounding hard enough for the neighbors to peek through blinds. "I lost the Carson Lane tenants," he slurred. "They moved out, said they didn't feel safe." She let him in, and he collapsed onto the couch, reeking of whiskey and panic. "What are we going to do?" he mumbled. "I don't know," she said. But that wasn't true. She had one idea. She opened her laptop, pulled up an old email thread from Charles Hanley, the lawyer. She'd found it weeks ago, buried in her spam folder. A message he'd sent once, long ago, before things went off the rails. She drafted a new message, hesitated, then deleted it. Instead, she typed out a different email. Subject: To Mom. The body was short. "I don't know what you want from us. I don't know how this ends. But please, can we talk?" She hit send. An hour later, Ethan stirred from the couch. "What are you doing?" "I emailed her," Lori said. "Tried to open a door. She won't respond." "I know." The next day, Martha didn't reply. She didn't call. She didn't answer. She simply forwarded the email to Charles, who added it to the case file. It was the first time Lori felt truly invisible. Ethan tried his own version later that week, left a voicemail at the rehab center, voice cracking with artificial contrition. "Mom, please, this got out of hand. We can work something out. Let's be reasonable." Martha deleted the message without listening to the end. Their desperation grew. Lori called the courthouse, asked to speak to the clerk, pretended to be confused about a filing date. The clerk, curt and unimpressed, said everything was available online. Ethan visited the old property manager of the Maple Drive house, hoping to reclaim authority. The man handed him a letter from Charles. "Your services are no longer required," it said. No explanation, just the truth, that they were being shut out, systematically, thoroughly, by their own mother. They had thought they were clever, but she had been planning longer, and she was better at this than they'd ever guessed. A week later, the dam burst. Ethan and Lori had another fight, this time loud enough for the neighbors to hear through the thin condo walls. "You've never taken care of her," Ethan shouted. "Not once. You moved 2 states away for your job and only came back when she got sick." "Oh, please," Lori fired back. "You lived 10 minutes from her and couldn't even mow the lawn without asking for gas money. Don't act like some martyr now." Ethan pointed a trembling finger. "You were the one who pushed to sell the house. You said she'd be better off in a facility. And you agreed. I trusted you." They glared at each other, breathing hard, the space between them filled with too many years of bitterness, finally set ablaze. The next morning, Ethan drove to the rehab center. He stood at the front desk, asking, then begging, for a few minutes with Martha. "I'm her son," he said. "Please, she'll want to see me." The receptionist checked her list, glanced at the clock. "I'm sorry. She's declined all outside visits except her attorney and medical advocate." Ethan's voice cracked. "Just 2 minutes, please." Security was called when he refused to leave. A nurse passing by looked at him, recognition flickering in her eyes, but there was no sympathy, only a quiet, professional boundary, as if she knew everything and had already made her judgment. Humiliated, Ethan stumbled back to his car. The silence in the vehicle was deafening. That night, Lori sent one last email. Subject: "Please, Mom, I don't know what else to say. We were wrong. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that. Please, just please." It went unanswered. Martha, sitting in her recliner with Charles reviewing the next legal filing, didn't even blink when she saw it. "I think we're done with the begging phase," she said. Charles nodded. "They always think the apology matters more than the damage." Martha closed the laptop. Outside, the sky was turning gold. Inside, silence held the shape of strength. The Willow Street house was emptied on a Thursday morning. It wasn't a dramatic eviction. No sheriff, no flashing lights. Just 2 movers hired by Charles, a locksmith, and a quiet notice from the court taped to the front door. Ethan wasn't even home. When he returned and saw the truck out front, he thought someone had the wrong address. Then he saw his belongings, boxed, labeled, and already halfway into the truck bed. "What the hell is this?" One of the movers looked up. "You've been served, sir. Judge signed the removal order last week." "No one told me anything. We're just following instructions." Inside, the house looked unfamiliar. Stripped, cold, the walls were bare, his photos gone. Even the clock above the kitchen had been taken down. His rage simmered into silence. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. He just stood in the middle of the living room until the last box was carried out. That afternoon, he checked into a motel on the edge of town. Lori fared no better. The condo association had received an anonymous tip, likely from Charles, about unpaid fees and multiple complaints from neighbors. A formal warning arrived in her mailbox. Violation of lease terms, subject to review and eviction. She tried to reach out to the association head, but her calls went to voicemail. When she visited in person, the receptionist looked at her like someone who had read the news and silently chosen a side. A day later, Lori received a certified letter from the State Ethics Board. Her position at the accounting firm was under evaluation pending an internal investigation. Someone had reported her for conflict of interest related to Martha's estate. Her name, once respected in their small town, was now whispered behind cupped hands at the grocery store. A cashier who used to chat with her now avoided eye contact. When she drove to pick up takeout, her usual parking spot had a note taped to the pole, reserved for honest people. The message wasn't subtle. Ethan called her from the motel. Rachel filed for divorce. Lori didn't respond. He continued, "She's going for full custody." Still, she said nothing. "What do we do now?" he asked. The silence stretched. "Lori?" "I don't know," she said finally. "I think we're out of options." Their world had narrowed to court dates, notices, and unanswered messages. They were no longer the people who sat in hospital cafeterias making plans. They were the people plans happened to, and all of it, every bit of it, was traceable to one woman, their mother, who had once made pancakes and packed lunches and worked 16-hour days in a diner to send them to summer camp, who now, through silence and precision, had undone them completely. And she hadn't even raised her voice. The motel room smelled like bleach and loneliness. Ethan dropped his duffel onto the sagging bedspread and stared at the ceiling. A single light flickered overhead. The wallpaper was peeling near the window. The TV remote didn't work. He sat on the edge of the bed and buried his face in his hands. This was the man who once walked into his mother's house without knocking, who had laughed at her lace curtains, mocked her old Pyrex dishes. Now he'd give anything for a plate of her overcooked meatloaf and a night on the lumpy couch she never replaced. Lori, meanwhile, had tried to text her old college roommate, a woman she'd once leaned on after. "My new home was a small blue house on the edge of town. Not flashy, not grand, but mine. It sat on a quiet corner lot with a porch swing that creaked when the wind passed through. The grass out front was already overgrown by the time I moved in, but Charles had hired someone to mow it before I arrived. The keys were warm from sitting in his palm when he placed them in mine. 'No one can touch this one,' he said. I smiled, the kind that comes slow and tired. Good. Inside, the house smelled of dust and pine cleaner. The walls were freshly painted a pale yellow that caught the light. The kitchen had a wide window over the sink, and the fridge hummed like it was thinking hard. The first thing I unpacked was a box labeled Diner. It had my old uniform, still with the name patch stitched above the heart, and a ceramic coffee mug with a chip in the lip. I set it in the cupboard beside a new set of dishes I'd bought with cash. No heirlooms, no gifts from the kids, just things I chose for myself. The rehab facility had released me with a clean bill of health and a warning to avoid stress. I followed half their advice. My health returned. But I didn't avoid anything. Every letter, every call, every court date, I faced them. Now, with the dust beginning to settle, I could breathe without checking who was behind me. The neighbors were kind. On my second day, a woman named Marie brought over banana bread and told me about the block potluck happening that weekend. I said I might stop by. I didn't. Not yet. I needed the quiet more than I needed conversation. Each morning, I made myself coffee and sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my knees. I watched joggers pass. I counted dogs on leashes. I started to recognize the rhythm of the street. This house had belonged to a woman named Dorothy, who'd passed away 2 years ago. Her children lived in another state and sold the house for well below market value. I bought it quietly, in cash, through Charles. No mortgage, no debt. Just a roof and a front door that locked. I started walking again, slowly at first, around the block, then a bit further. I waved to the mailman. I began shopping at the local farmers market on Thursdays. I even went back to the old diner once, just for a cup of coffee. The new owner recognized me, offered a slice of pie on the house. I declined, but I smiled. There was no bitterness in my refusal, just a sense that I didn't owe anyone anything, not anymore. That's what freedom looked like. The bedroom was smaller than my old one, but it had a window that looked out over the backyard where a lone birch tree stood. Its leaves trembled at the slightest breeze. Some mornings I'd open the window just to hear them. At night, I slept without medication, without fear, without wondering who might be talking behind a closed door. The legal case was still moving, slowly. Charles kept me updated, but I didn't rush it. I had time now. I had space. I had peace. And that was something no one could sell out from under me again. There was something meditative about rebuilding from scratch. I arranged my bookshelf by color, not title, hung small paintings from a local thrift store instead of family portraits. I bought a fiddle leaf fig and named it Dot, after the woman who owned the house before me. She leaned toward the light like she knew where to go. One morning I caught myself humming while folding towels. Another, I spent 2 hours organizing the junk drawer, not because I needed to, but because it felt good to create order. Charles took me out to lunch the week after my birthday. We went to a little cafe just down the road from the diner. Not the old haunt, not quite, but close enough. "I don't think I've seen you this relaxed since I met you," he said. "I don't think I've been this relaxed since ever." He smiled and didn't press further. We split a slice of apple pie and talked about nothing important. It was perfect. Later that day, I stopped at the market to pick up rosemary and lemons. At the flower stand, I bought a small bundle of lavender. On the way out, I saw a little girl sitting cross-legged on the curb, chin in her hands. Her mother was scanning the parking lot, clearly flustered. I bent down and handed the girl the lavender. "For you," I said, "because you're patient." She beamed like I'd given her the moon. Her mother mouthed, "Thank you," as they walked away. That night, I placed a second bundle of lavender in a jar by my bed. When I turned off the light, the scent followed me into sleep. I was building something again. Not a legacy, not a reputation, just a life. One I could actually live. It started with banana bread. Marie from next door stopped by one morning with a tin of her famous recipe and a sheepish smile. "I know you don't usually come to the potlucks," she said, "but I told the ladies about your diner, and now they want to meet you." I chuckled. "Tell them I retired my apron." Marie grinned. "They don't believe in retirement." That weekend, I walked the short block to the church basement and found myself surrounded by folding tables, crock pots, and a sea of women who knew each other's grandkids by name. Someone handed me a paper plate. Someone else poured me lemonade. By the end of the afternoon, I was swapping stories about gravy disasters and learning 3 variations of cornbread stuffing. The following Thursday, I brought cookies to the market and handed them out with handwritten tags, "Baked by Martha." I didn't charge. I didn't need to. But I liked seeing people smile. It felt like muscle memory, not just the baking, but the act of giving. The quiet way food could say, "You're not alone." A month later, Marie mentioned that the community center was starting a program for older adults who wanted to re-enter the workforce or just feel useful again. They needed someone to teach basic cooking. I said I'd think about it. I didn't have to. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of a group of nervous women in thrifted aprons, showing them how to cut onions without crying and how to fold dough like it owed you money. Most had never cooked for anyone but their kids. Some were recently widowed, others just lonely. But by the end of the first class, there was laughter echoing off the linoleum. It wasn't a career. It wasn't charity. It was purpose. Charles came by one afternoon to drop off some papers and found me surrounded by mismatched Tupperware, packing leftover soup into small containers. "You feeding the whole neighborhood?" I shrugged. "Just the ones who need it." He paused in the doorway. You know, a lot of people would have just moved away, started fresh somewhere else. I didn't want to disappear, I said. I wanted to matter. He nodded. Later that week, a woman named Ellen pulled me aside after class. She looked down as she spoke, twisting the strap of her purse. My daughter. She took out a credit card in my name. I didn't want to tell anyone. I sat with her. We talked. I gave her Charles's card. A month after that, she had her finances back and started volunteering at the center. The ripple was small, but it was real. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something for other women like me, women who had been overlooked, taken for granted, or used like stepping stones. We deserved more. And I had time now. I had wisdom. I had a kitchen full of measuring cups and a stack of stories worth sharing. The past would never fully disappear, but neither would I. The next time Ellen came to class, she brought her own homemade banana bread. It was a little overcooked, the edges crisped too dark. But she beamed as she handed me a slice, like it was proof she'd made it through something. I mailed in the police report, she said. I even called the credit bureau myself. I hugged her without hesitation. That night, I stayed up printing flyers. Nothing fancy, just bold letters at the top. Know your rights, elder financial protection. I listed phone numbers, legal aid contacts, a quote from Charles, and at the bottom, in small script, you are not alone. Martha. I handed them out at the market the next Saturday. Some people looked confused, some smiled politely, but a few, mostly older women with quiet eyes, took one, folded it neatly, and tucked it into their purse without a word. That was enough. Later, as the afternoon sun filtered through the blinds in my kitchen, I baked a batch of apple muffins for Monday's class. The cinnamon made the whole house smell like fall. As I sprinkled the tops with sugar, I thought of Ellen, of Dot, the fiddle leaf fig, of every woman who'd ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, be grateful. And I smiled, because this was mine. A new rhythm, a new purpose, and a soft, steady kind of power I'd never known I was allowed to have. The letter arrived in early spring. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. Ethan's. Inside was a single page, carefully folded. Mom. I don't know what to say anymore. I think about what we did every day. I think about the house, the way we sold it like it was just a piece of furniture, and how we justified it to ourselves. I don't expect you to forgive us, but I hope you're okay. If you ever want to talk, you know where I am. There was no apology. Not really, just a memory dressed as regret. I placed the letter in a drawer I rarely opened, not out of anger, not anymore, but because I'd already chosen peace. That week, the garden behind the house started to bloom. The bulbs I planted back in winter, tulips, daffodils, a single line of irises, pushed up through the soil like small promises. I spent the morning weeding, gloved and sun-hatted, and let the dirt settle into the cracks of my hands. Lori sent an email the next day. Subject line, just wondering. It was shorter than Ethan's. I saw you at the market last week. You looked happy. That's all. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. I wasn't cruel. I didn't wish them harm. But I also didn't wish them back. Some bridges weren't burned. They were quietly dismantled, piece by piece, by those who once walked them without care. Now, I spent my mornings baking, my afternoons walking, my evenings reading mystery novels I always pretended I could solve. Sometimes I caught myself laughing at nothing. Sometimes I danced in the kitchen when a good song came on the radio. One Thursday, a young woman at the community center hugged me after class and whispered, "You remind me of my grandmother. She passed, But she used to say, "A woman is a home." I smiled and touched her hand. "Then I hope you feel safe here." At night, I looked out my window and watched the lights come on across the neighborhood. Each glow was someone's story, someone's noise, someone's peace. And mine was quiet, not empty, not silent, just steady and mine. That night, I couldn't sleep, not out of restlessness, but something else, something lighter. I got out of bed just before sunrise and padded into the bathroom. The mirror was still fogged from my earlier shower. I wiped it clean and looked at myself. My hair was all silver now, but I didn't reach for dye. The lines on my face told stories that no one could sell, rewrite, or erase. I touched my collar, straightened it, and whispered to my reflection, "You made it." It wasn't a declaration. It was a quiet acknowledgement. Later, I opened the front door, stepped onto the porch, and pulled the blanket around my shoulders. The town was just beginning to stir. A dog barked 3 blocks away. The first light of morning spilled down Willow Street, though it no longer held my name. And that was okay. Peace, I'd learned, wasn't always the absence of noise. Sometimes it was the absence of need. I sat down, coffee in hand, lavender in bloom beside me. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't want more. I simply wanted the day, and it was mine,